Welcome to Kevin Dale Photography, where I take you on my journey through photography. On today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at the 135mm f1.4 from Sigma. Welcome to today's episode. If you're not familiar with Kevin Dale Photography, we do gear reviews, tips, techniques, and tutorials, and sometimes we dive into film. If any of that sounds appealing to you, click the subscribe button below. For all of you who are back to Kevin Dale Photography, welcome back. And for all you where this is your first time here, at the beginning of every episode, I ask for donations to Big. And if you like presets, I do make presets for both Lightroom and Capture One. If you want to check those out, I'll leave a link in the description below. But to the subject of today's episode. Many of you watching may have seen my review of the Sigma 200mm f2 for the L mount. In that video, I mentioned that while the 200mm is an absolute beast for portraits, I was curious how close I could get to that look using the Sigma 135 f1.4. After all, 135mm and 200mm are both very long focal lengths that compress the background rather nicely. And since the 135 is a full stop faster at f1.4, my educated guess was that the subject isolation would be pretty similar. Well, I don't have to guess anymore because I bought the 135mm f1.4 and it's right here in my hands. For some reason, I decided to put it on my S9, maybe because it just looks gargantuan on this small body. And many of you who watched my 200mm f2 review asked me to do a comparison between the two lenses, so I will. This lens immediately grabbed my attention because I'm a portrait photographer. I love the 200mm f2, but it's about a pound heavier, 2.5 inches longer, and roughly $1,400 more expensive. Plus, shooting portraits at 200mm puts you at the edge of shouting distance, while 135 lets you be a little closer and communicate more naturally with your subject. It's also worth noting that both lenses use a 105mm front filter, so if you decide to get both, you can share the same filter system. Now, my hope is that this 135mm becomes a staple in my portrait kit. We're gonna have to run this guy through its paces, through some real world tests, but before we get started on all of that, let's go over the specs. The Sigma 135mm f1.4 DG Art lens is a full-frame autofocus lens for the Sony E and L mount systems. It has an aperture range of f1.4 to f16. It features a built-in aperture ring with a click and declick switch, as well as a dedicated aperture ring lock switch. It has an angle of view of 18.2 degrees. It has a minimum focusing distance of 43.3 inches or 110 centimeters. It has a magnification of 0.14. It has an optical design of 17 elements and 13 groups, and it has 13 rounded aperture blades. This lens is not image stabilized. This lens is weather sealed. It has a front filter thread size of 105mm. It has a removable and rotating collar. It has a built-in programmable button. Its dimensions are 4.4 by 5.5 inches or 111 by 135 millimeters. It comes in at a weight of 3.15 pounds or 1.43 kilograms, and it comes in at a street price of $1,899 US. Those specifications sounded great on paper. Now let's take this guy out into the real world and do some tests. you're a regular on this channel, you probably know I am a portrait photographer, and this montage is heavy on portraits. The bokeh is top-notch on this 135 1.4. I'd expect nothing less. It hangs up there with some of my 1.2 lenses, but I know a lot of you don't just want to see portraits, so the World Cup was going on, and I was in downtown Dallas, and they had some tributes to the World Cup on the Wrong Kirk pedestrian bridge. So I took pictures of the flags, I tested out the autofocus, and as you can see right here, that 135 compresses those buildings very close to the flags. Not my best work. Some of these shots I was a bit too tight, but this gives you a little bit more of a demonstration about how this lens renders. Now, I can't shoot everything on this lens. I did not have time to shoot sports photography. My apologies, but let's see how well this guy does with wildlife. Now, I don't fancy myself as a wildlife photographer, and I definitely can't do a David Attenborough voiceover as these two birds have a showdown. But as I sat there and waited for one of these birds to make a move, I got lucky, and here's the sequence that I got. In my opinion, 135 probably isn't long enough for a lot of wildlife, probably better for close-up sports, and as you can see, I missed a little bit with the autofocus, but that's not necessarily the fault of the lens, sometimes it's the fault of the camera.
Okay, so I'm sure a lot of you are wondering, 200mm f2, 135 f1.4, well, I own them both. So let's get to the bottom of this question. Let's shoot some portraiture with both the 200mm f2 and the 135 1.4.
All right, so you can see on the top, we have the 135 shot at 1.4, 1/3200th of a second, and then I halved that shutter speed because it's at f2 instead of 1.4. So as we zoom in and I look at both of these files, they both look incredibly sharp. However, my eyes are telling me that that 200mm f2 is a little sharper and has a little bit more contrast wide open. And then when you look at the bokeh on the outside, I'd say the 1.4 has probably a little bit better liquidation. Zooming in, I don't really see any chromatic aberrations on either of these lenses, so they perform very well there. I would say there's slightly more orange in the highlights on the 200mm f2. Of course, all of that is easily correctable in post-production. I feel like as we move to this second shot, it becomes a little bit more obvious how much more subject isolation you do get out of the 135. Of course, how much subject isolation you actually need is entirely up to you. I think both of these are perfectly acceptable. And of course, as I've already mentioned, I give a slight nod in sharpness and contrast to that 200mm f2. So now let's stop down the 135 to f2, and because they're shooting at the same aperture, the settings are exactly the same. And as you zoom in right here, you can see from a sharpness standpoint, they kind of look the same. Not really seeing much of a difference at all. As I go down to the bottom of the frame, I'm not noticing much difference at all here. Maybe slightly more contrast on that 200mm f2. Compression is a tiny bit different, what you're seeing on that back wall. But otherwise, I would say that these lenses look pretty darn close at f2. So on that 135, you do get a slight loss of sharpness and contrast at 1.4, but the 200mm can't even go to 1.4. So whether or not that extra stop of light is worth it to you, well, that's entirely up to you. But remember, it weighs less, it costs less, and it's a little shorter. Okay, so I have a bunch of time under my belt now with this lens. We always talk about the pros and the cons at the end of every review, and we always start with the cons. So let's start with the cons. While this lens is much more manageable in focal length than its 200mm f2 sibling, it still may be too long for some of you portrait photographers, especially if you operate in a studio. Outside of headshots, you may encounter some challenges in a studio environment unless you have enough room. If you primarily work in the studio, I'm going to make the same recommendation I did with my 200mm review and tell you you'd be better off with a 70 to 200. After all, most of you are shooting stopped down in a studio environment, and with most good lenses stopped down, the differences in sharpness from lens to lens are marginal at best. So you might as well take advantage of the versatility of a 70-200 instead. This is a con of the focal length for sure, and not anything Sigma did wrong, but it's still something you should consider if you're inexperienced with the 135mm focal length. And I did personally experience this during my testing. I really loved these shots, however, I wish I used a shorter focal length. I backed up to my wall in my studio and I couldn't go any further. And as you can see right here, I truncated some of these images. So once again, 70-200 or a shorter focal length is much more practical in the studio. Too heavy is relative. I don't think this lens is super heavy for what it is, but if you're sensitive to weight, you may find this lens to be a bit too heavy for your liking. It's over 3 pounds or 1.5 kilos. If you do all-day events, that might be more than you want to haul around all day. Now, you can remove the tripod collar and it will weigh a little less, but I didn't really notice the weight difference without the tripod collar. And because the collar gives me more to grab onto, I'd rather have it attached. And also, if you're shooting with a smaller camera body, like when I attached this to my S9, it's pretty front heavy, so you may be combating balance issues. I appreciated the included lens hood for this 135, but I wish it had a window I could access so I could adjust filters like CPLs. Canon did this with their 70-200 f2.8, and I really appreciated it. I wish it were present on this 135 from Sigma as well. Speaking of filters, this uses a 105mm front filter thread size, which is extremely large, and due to the amount of glass it needs, just about all filters you would purchase for this lens are going to be on the expensive side. And because 105mm is rather large, that makes the front element vulnerable to getting hit. So I would always recommend leaving the lens hood on and making the investment in a protective filter, which adds to the overall cost, so I'm putting it under the cons. The lens cap falls off rather easily when transporting it in its provided pouch. This means the cap could rub against the front element, which I personally don't want on a $2,000 lens. So once again, the additional investment of a protective filter is essential for this lens. If you don't make this investment, you could potentially damage the front element when transporting it in its provided pouch. Speaking of the provided pouch, for a lens that goes for $1,899, this pouch sucks. Sigma did the same thing with the 200mm f2, which is over $3,000 and even more unforgivable. It's pretty obvious that the packaging is environmentally friendly, which I'm fine with, but companies like Sirui give me nylon bags for lenses that cost 5 times less, and Sigma themselves used to do the same thing. Here's my 70mm f2.8 macro and its nylon bag. This lens costs like 3 times more than that lens, and it doesn't come with a protective nylon bag. I expect Sigma to do better for their customers when it comes to protecting a lens this expensive. It's totally reasonable for somebody buying a flagship 135mm lens to expect better protection. Why Sigma cheaped out on that protection with a crappy lens cap and a lame protective cover is beyond me. For videographers, the declicked aperture ring in video mode was smooth. However, you can absolutely hear the internals of the motors making noise as the aperture opens and closes. So if you have microphones near this lens, you're almost certainly going to pick up the lens noise. Please keep that in mind if you're considering this lens for video. I'll talk about the overall inclusion of a variable detachable tripod collar in the pros, but one thing I don't like about this lens is that you have to use your eyes to line up the 90-degree stations. On its 200mm f2 sibling, there are detents at 90-degree increments that you can feel while you use the lens. On this 135, you have to stop what you're doing and actually look where the tripod collar is lining up and use the visual guides on the lens. Personally, for almost $2,000, I think they should have retained the detents from the 200mm. And now to the biggest con of this lens, there is no support for teleconverters. So for those of you who are thinking about getting this 135 and then using a teleconverter to get some extra reach, well, that's not how it's going to pan out for you. You're still going to have to purchase another longer lens to pull that off. And that's a real shame because I own both the 135 and the 200 now, and if a teleconverter could get me closer to the 200mm focal length, I might actually consider selling that lens off. All right, that's it for the cons. There were some, and with a lens this expensive, you would be a little bit more picky about the things that you liked and didn't like. Now, let's talk about the positive aspects of this 135 1.4, of which there were many. Let's start with the fact that this is a 1.4 lens. As far as I know, it's the first of its kind. 1.8 was the previous maximum aperture you could find on the market. So Sigma has now made a lens that is 2/3 of a stop brighter than the competition. The minimum focusing distance is very usable. It's not class leading. My Canon 135 1.8 IS can actually get as close as 2.3 feet or 0.7 meters, where this Sigma has to get back 3.6 feet or 1.1 meters from its subject. Now, the real question is, in the real world, will that really matter? I would say probably not. If you're watching this video, you're likely going to be at least 10 feet back from anything you're shooting anyway. And anything I would want to get really close to, I'd probably use another lens for those duties anyway. The lack of image stabilization on this lens turned out to be a non-issue for me as well. Conventional wisdom is that you should keep your minimum shutter speed around your focal length. So basically, 1/125th is traditionally the slowest you should go on a 135 lens to get consistent sharpness and minimize camera shake. With my Canon RF 135 f1.8, which has image stabilization paired with the IBIS built into my R5s, I was able to get shots as slow as 1/13th of a second, razor sharp. I was able to match that performance with this non-image stabilized lens on my S1R2, which also has IBIS. So at the end of the day, like I said, the lack of image stabilization is a non-issue, and combined with Lumix's stellar IBIS, the fact that I was able to get 1/13th of a second shots is a genuine pro. Plus, the lack of stabilization keeps the price point lower and the weight down. I think Sigma figured that most of you who shoot on Sony and Lumix already have great IBIS, and in most shooting scenarios, that can do the heavy lifting for this lens. In my actual real-world testing, that turned out to be true. I love that it comes with a removable tripod collar. For those of you shooting sports on a monopod, this will come in handy. But some of you are perfectly happy grabbing the lens by the barrel and would rather shed the tripod collar to make your bag a little lighter and the footprint of this lens a little smaller. You have that option. You also have the ability to rotate the tripod collar variably around this lens. There's a built-in customizable button. I personally use it to change the size of my autofocus area box, but you can program it to do anything your camera will allow you to set it to. I'm always going to throw extra customizable buttons for any camera under the pros. I love the fact that this lens comes with a click and declick feature for the aperture ring. So if you're the type of shooter who wants tactile steps in 1/3 stop increments, Sigma has you covered. If you're the type who doesn't want to bother with an aperture ring, simply move it to the A position and you can control the aperture from a dial on your camera. And of course, if you like to shoot smooth video transitions, you can declick the aperture ring and you're good to go. Just remember what I said about the lens noise when shooting video. The construction quality of this lens is top notch. It doesn't feel quite as good as the 200mm f2 Sport, but it does feel on par with my Canon RF lenses, which themselves are flagship lenses. It does share one thing in common with its larger 200mm sibling, and that's a rubber bumper on the front of the lens hood. This allows you to set your whole camera rig nose down on rough surfaces like gravel or concrete, and you don't have to worry about your lens hood getting scratched up in the process. Combine that with the fact that this lens is weather sealed and you have an all-around winner in terms of construction quality. I like how the lens hood clicks and declicks into place, and it's easy to find the button to detach it. I actually feel like the lens hood overall on this is superior to the more expensive 200mm f2, which has that tightening mechanism on the hood that takes more time to install and uninstall. Now, let's talk about image quality. Being a 1.4 lens is impressive, but not if it comes with softness and chromatic aberration. I'm happy to report that this lens, wide open, is pretty darn sharp, and the chromatic aberration was pretty much non-existent. Definitely worthy of calling this lens an optical powerhouse. Now, when you shoot this at 1.4 versus the 200mm at f2, I am giving a slight nod to the 200mm. It is optically a little better wide open. However, when you stop this lens down to f2 to match it, I can't really tell the difference. And the 200mm can't go to 1.4. So I really don't care if there is a slight reduction in contrast wide open on this lens. Plus, it's so subtle that you really only notice it when you put the files up side by side. If you showed these 1.4 images without any sort of comparison to any random person and asked them if these images look sharp, they'd say very sharp. I would categorize the optical performance of this lens in the ballpark of the upper tier of what is available in 2026. Are there sharper lenses? Yes, like my Canon RF135 1.8. It's slightly sharper wide open, but it's also a 1.8 lens, and this is a 1.4 lens. Now let's talk about value. I just said this is the only 1.4 135mm lens on the market, and it comes at a lower price than most first-party lenses that are 135mm and have darker maximum apertures. I paid $2,100 for my Canon RF 135mm 1.8. I'm pretty sure the Sony version is also more than this lens. And once again, this is f1.4. It's top-notch materials, and it's 2/3 of a stop brighter than anything else on the market. To me, that makes this lens an incredible value at $1,899. If you're an environmental portrait photographer or sports photographer who could benefit from having a 135mm lens, the price of this lens should get your attention. For Sony shooters, depending on your budget, you might also want to look at the Viltrox 135mm f1.8 lab. It might get you pretty close in terms of image quality, but for half the price and a slightly darker maximum aperture. So, should you purchase this lens? The first question is whether or not the focal length makes sense to you. Some people get excited about the prospect of owning a 135mm lens because oftentimes they are super sharp and look flattering on portraits, only to find out that for their use, it's a bit too long. Don't just fall in love with the images you see on these YouTube reviews. Really think about the physical spaces that you work in first before considering a lens this long. If you think the focal length would be a good fit, then I absolutely recommend this lens. The real question is, will this lens replace my 200mm f2? Well, I'm struggling with that. I can't unsee the fact that the 200mm f2 at f2 is just slightly sharper with slightly better contrast. But you can also argue the fact that the 135mm has better subject isolation when shot wide open, and it can be at much more manageable distances from my subject. My gut is telling me that if this 200mm didn't exist for comparison, that I would be perfectly happy with the 135mm f1.4, and I'll bet a lot of you feel the same way. And if I'm being honest with myself, the 135 wide open is still insanely and beautifully sharp. So why sweat the small stuff in the first place, unless you were hoping to use this lens with teleconverters? But the only thing that matters to you, the viewer, is what you think about this lens. Does it check enough boxes for you? Do you think it's a great value and an optical powerhouse? Did I show you enough examples to push your decision one way or the other? For those of you who are convinced that this is worth paying your hard-earned dollars for, I'll leave a link where you can pick it up in the description below. That does it for today's episode. What did you think of my review of this 135 1.4? Do you think it's worth the money? Tell me about it in the comments below. Did you go in another direction? Do you prefer another focal length? Tell us all about that in the comments below and why. And if you're a fan of this channel, I humbly ask you to click the subscribe button below. And until next time, I'll talk to you soon. Bye.